Hi, welcome to the TC. My name's David, and today we're going to be taking a look at the iPhone 13 Pro Max in 2024. And basically, this is going to be a long-term review of the iPhone 13 Pro Max. So, let's get into the review. So I've had the iPhone 13 Pro Max now for about a year, I want to say. I got it back in March, and I was coming from an iPhone 12 Pro Max. So the difference for me wasn't like a super huge difference, but I do think that there is still quite a improvement for going into the 13 Pro Max over the previous iPhones. Maybe not so much with the 12 Pro Max, but if you're coming from like an 11 Pro Max or older, there's definitely a huge jump. But today I'm basically going to be giving some of my own thoughts on the iPhone 13 Pro Max and how it's been for me over the past year to help you decide whether or not it's worth buying in 2024 or if you should bother upgrading now. So I'm going to be splitting up the review in a couple different chapters as well, and you can go down into the description and I'll put the chapters in there, and it'll also show up on YouTube's timeline. So if you want to skip to a specific chapter, you can do so, or you can watch the whole review too, whichever works for you. So the first chapter that I want to talk about is the design and the display of the iPhone 13 Pro Max. And overall, the design of the iPhone 13 Pro Max is essentially the same as the 12 Pro Max. They have the same size screen, the body is basically the same, and I think they're basically the same phone when it comes to design. The only thing that didn't really change is the new color option that you could get. Instead of Pacific Blue, they had Sierra Blue, which is what I have here. In my opinion, I feel like the Pacific Blue was a nicer color, but Sierra Blue is alright too. They also later added a green option, but I don't really see that one too often, so that might be the most rare option for the 13 Pro and Pro Max. On the front of the phone, although the screen size is the same, it does have a smaller notch, and this was like with the entire 13 series. And because of that smaller notch, it does help modernize it a little bit, in my opinion. However, it does still have a notch, and for a phone today to have a notch, I feel like is a bit antiquated. However, even like the new iPhone has like the dynamic island, but it's still essentially a hole punch in the screen. So I feel like with phones today, we've kind of hit a peak, and they're trying to like have the features spread out over different releases. But with a 13 Pro Max, if you don't really care about the notch, then yeah, I mean, it's fine. It's there. It's smaller at least. The biggest thing though with the 13 Pro Max and the 13 Pro was the introduction of ProMotion on the iPhone. And I think that itself was probably the best change that they could have done to the iPhone. And it really helps the 13 Pro Max feel like a lot newer of a phone. So I would argue that ProMotion is probably the best feature that the 13 Pro and Pro Max has on its display, along with it being a pretty bright display. So if you're in direct sunlight, it's pretty easy to read. And yeah, I mean, it's really just an iPhone display. So you've got great colors, great dynamic range, great HDR, and of course it's an OLED panel, but now you've also got the 120 Hertz, which basically makes it as good as you can get for an iPhone display. Now the body is essentially the same as the 12 Pro Max, so you do get the stainless steel edges and a front and rear glass like sandwich, but the rear glass of course is the frosted glass because it is a Pro model. And the camera lens array, it is bigger than the 12 Pro Max, but not by much, I would say. It's still reasonable, and if you're like holding your phone sideways, it doesn't get too much in the way. I can't see it being a problem with the regular 13 Pro, but with the Pro Max, it's more than enough space to hold your phone without touching the camera. The buttons on the iPhone 13 Pro Max are also very clicky, they feel good, and of course you do get that mute switch still, which is gone now from the current generation Pro iPhones. So if you'd like having a mute switch, this has got one. One thing that you might not like though is that this iPhone does still use the Lightning connector. And it's also a good and a bad thing in my opinion, because a lot of people who had iPhones are going to have a ton of iPhone accessories that use Lightning. But if you're coming from something like Android, or if you want to have all the same charger for all your devices, then yeah, not having USB-C is a bit of a letdown there. That being said, you also have MagSafe on the back. This was carried over from the 12 series, so For me, it's not too much of an issue because I have so many different iPhone accessories, but also I've been utilizing MagSafe for charging. So when I need to charge it, I'll just throw it on my MagSafe charger and it's done, you know? But yeah, I wish it did have USB-C, but at least now we have USB-C. So one thing I do want to note too with the 13 Pro and the Pro Max is that the speaker on the top of the device is actually more towards the edge now versus in the notch like it was previously. Of course, this was to make the notch smaller, but it doesn't really change the quality of it, but it is something to note just because it kind of looks kind of odd, but I got used to it after a while. And yeah, I mean, it's fine. So that's pretty much it for the design of the iPhone 13 Pro Max. The next chapter that I do want to talk about is the camera system. So the camera system on the iPhone 13 Pro Max consists of 4 cameras. Well, it's actually 5 if you count the LiDAR sensor, but since it's not actively taking a photo that you can see, I'm not going to count it as a camera. So there's a total of 4 or 5, depending on how you see it, cameras on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. You have the standard camera on the rear, and that's going to be your best sensor on this phone. It's a 12 megapixel sensor, and it's about a 24 to 26 millimeter equivalent in focal length, and it has the widest aperture of all the different lenses or cameras on the iPhone 13 Pro Max, so it lets in the most amount of light, and of course it does have this sensor shift stabilization. So that's going to be your primary camera, and then you also have the ultra wide, and that's going to be your widest angle lens, and that's a 13 millimeter camera lens for the ultra wide, so you do get quite a bit of field of view. And with that one, it also has the autofocus motor now, so they introduce macro onto the iPhone. So once you get close up to a subject, it will engage the macro camera, which is the ultra wide camera. And the final lens that we have here on the back is the telephoto. With the 13 Pro Max, you also get the 3x telephoto, which means that, so if you're coming from an older iPhone, this one now has a 77 millimeter equivalent telephoto lens, whereas the older iPhones had about a 50 millimeter equivalent lens. So you do get quite a bit more reach, but it does come at the hit of low light performance because it has a smaller aperture than the previous telephoto lenses. So you can't let in as much light. So this is really only useful in really bright situations. So in a sunny day, for example. Now, that being said, whenever you're using the camera and you're in a low light situation, if you engage the telephoto lens, it will technically always switch back to the 1x if it thinks that there's not that much light, which is an unfortunate thing because you do take quite a big hit on the quality of the photo because you're using basically a cropped portion of that 1x lens. You're losing a lot of resolution. So I would try to avoid using the telephoto if you're in a dark situation, just because you're using the main sensor instead. So another thing that I also want to mention is that when you do go into the macro mode using the ultra wide camera, it tends to lose quite a bit of quality when you're in darker situations just because it doesn't have the same optical quality as the main sensor. One of the biggest things that annoys me with the iPhone 13 Pro Max is that if I'm trying to focus on something that's close up, it will always switch to the macro camera, and then I have to tell the camera that I don't want it to use the macro. And for me, sometimes I've missed shots just because the camera thinks that I want macro when I want it to just be the 1x lens, which is really unfortunate because that wasn't an issue with the previous iPhone I had, which was the 12 Pro Max, because it didn't have the macro. So I wish Apple would just have a toggle where I can keep macro on or macro off. And they do have like this little flower icon thing that engages macro, and you can press that to turn off macro. But for me, it wastes time when I really need to get a shot, and I open the camera and then it uses the macro camera instead of the 1x. So for me, that's the biggest annoyance with the 13 Pro Max. And the final camera that it does have on the front is, of course, your selfie camera. It's also a 12 megapixel camera, and it's basically carried over. It does have the newer processing, so I think it's like HDR3. So you do get the newer processing, but I mean, it's going to be the least quality lens that you have, or the least quality camera that you have on this phone. So it's good enough for selfies, but that's basically it. One thing that this iPhone does have is the ability to record in 4K ProRes video. And ProRes is basically the form of like the highest resolution and bitrate that you can get on the iPhone, and it allows you to manipulate the colors a lot better, but it does come at the hit of quite a bit of storage usage. So when you engage ProRes, you're going to get this little like icon at the top saying how many minutes you have in ProRes that you can record. And then if you decide that you want to free up storage, you can tell it to free up storage. And if you need to free up more, then it will tell you to go into settings and delete stuff. But honestly, for most people, you don't need to touch ProRes at all, just because the regular 4K video out of the iPhone takes really amazing 4K video. It's not like super over processed, I want to say. The one thing I will say is that it kind of falls apart in the dark, but you kind of have to expect that out of a phone camera. And I mean, most cameras will fall apart in the dark, you know, they're not going to have the best ISO performance. But other than that though, give this camera plenty of light and you can shoot really amazing video with it. So one of the things I really like about the 13 Pro Max is of course the video, but you also have the ability to shoot in ProRAW with photos. And this was also carried over from the 12 Pro Max. And ProRAW is basically the raw format for taking photos on the iPhone, and allows you to have a lot more dynamic range and editing ability with your photos because it's not compressing it into a HEIF or JPEG file. And I've used ProRAW in a couple of different occasions, and it's guaranteed me quite a bit of nice like results. I used ProRAW back on my iPhone 12 Pro Max, and it's also the same. So if you're using ProRAW, I don't think you're going to have any issues with this phone. It's actually pretty nice to use, but do keep in mind that it will use quite a bit more storage. And that's basically it with the cameras on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. The next thing I do want to talk about is the performance and usability of this iPhone. So the iPhone 13 Pro Max does have the A15 Bionic chipset, and this was the one that has the 5-core GPU, and it also has a 6 gigabytes of RAM. So it's basically carried over onto the iPhone 14 the next year later, because that also carried over the same chipset and GPU from the 13 Pro and Pro Max. So I think basically that we've hit a peak with smartphones and the ability for chips to get faster and more efficient, and we're kind of feeling that now because this phone runs basically everything that the new iPhone can, and it runs it basically around the same. Of course, the new iPhone has stuff like ray tracing, but who's using ray tracing on their phone? They need it. And I would rather have all of that like be boiled down into efficiency rather than like computational speed. So with the iPhone 13 Pro Max, speed is not an issue, and it really shouldn't be an issue for anyone because it's plenty fast enough. And I mean, if they're using it on a 14, which is only about like a year and a half old now, then yeah, I mean, this phone is more than usable today. It's probably more than usable for the next like 3 years, honestly, just because the performance of phones have basically peaked. So yeah, if you're using a 13 Pro Max, it's not going to be any real issue for you for the next couple years when it comes down to performance and usability. The one thing I will say is I did wish it does have more RAM, just because I'd like to have apps open for longer in the background, but it's not a huge worry. But in the future, I can see that becoming more of a problem rather than the actual speed of the processor. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on the performance and usability of the iPhone 13 Pro Max. The next thing that I want to talk about is the battery. And the battery on the iPhone 13 Pro Max has been pretty great to me. I've never had an occasion where I was like, wow, my battery's going really, really quick. I really need to charge this. The only time that's ever happened to me was when I was at a concert and I was recording a bunch of 4K video, like nonstop, and I didn't realize my brightness was all the way up. So of course I ate through my battery, and by the end of the concert I was at 4%. When I had got there, I was around like 80. So yeah, I mean, in that kind of rare occasion, you can kill it. But for most people, because it is the Pro Max, it does have the largest battery, and you probably won't kill it unless you're a really big power user. So battery has not really been an issue. The one thing I will say, if you're looking at buying a used iPhone 13 Pro or Pro Max, or any used iPhone for that matter, make sure that you do check the battery health, as that can have a significant impact on how long the phone can last. This iPhone I have here, when I got it, had about 91%, and now I'm at 87. So I mean, so yeah, it does sound like a pretty big decrease, but in actual world usage, I haven't really noticed anything big or any big changes to my actual battery life. I will say though, like if you do have the opportunity to get something like AppleCare, it's not a bad thing to have, especially since it will cover your battery replacements. So the final thing that I do want to talk about is the special features and kind of just quirks of using the iPhone 13 Pro Max. So one of the special features that the 13 Pro and Pro Max offered was, of course, the cinematic mode video. And I think this is a really great thing for people who want to have that more cinematic look, like what I'm doing right now with my camera here. I'm shooting at a low aperture on a 50mm lens. So that's giving me a lot of background blur here. And basically cinematic mode does the same thing. It's tracking the person and it's blurring the background. And of course you can change focus. That's one thing with the iPhone that I really like, is the ability to change focus after taking the video. And of course you can't do that with a camera like this. It's going to be focused on whatever it's focused on. Right now it's focusing right on my eye. So it's going to keep that focus on my eye. And once the video is done recording, I can't change the focus. But with the iPhone, I can. And that's one huge advantage of using the iPhone. One huge disadvantage, though, of course, is that I can't use multiple lenses. I can't get better low light performance. And of course, I can't get it to look exactly like this, just because it's not going to cut the blur out perfectly around me. It's basically portrait mode, but in video. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. If anything, that's actually really great, because for most people, this is going to be more than enough than what they need. So having cinematic mode is pretty cool. One thing I will say though, I did wish it was at a higher quality, because you can only shoot cinematic mode in 1080p 30 FPS. But on the newer iPhones, they upgraded that to 4K. So I guess I had to leave some room for upgrades on the later iPhones, since, you know, we're kind of plateauing there. Oh, another really cool feature of the iPhone 13 Pro Max, of course, is that 120 Hz, as I mentioned before. It's probably one of my favorite features of the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max, just because, of course, you're using your display every single day. And yeah, I've had no issues with the 13 Pro Max and the 120 Hz, and it hasn't really affected the battery life either. So, you know, good win there. And so I think this pretty much ties up the iPhone 13 Pro Max and kind of a mini review and kind of sum up of all of its features. And now I just kind of want to talk about my experiences with it. And yeah, I mean, it's been a great phone. If anything, I would say the 13 Pro Max is more phone than you'll need for the next couple of years. Because, I mean, has there really been a huge reason to upgrade in the past 2 years? To me, there really hasn't. So if you're coming from an older iPhone, sure, I mean, the 13 Pro Max might be a good upgrade. But if anything, any modern iPhone would be a good upgrade. Like, they're all the same kind of now. And I think that's one thing that we're really going to have to see Apple kind of experiment on. Of course, the competition, such as Samsung and Google, are releasing folding phones. And it's really interesting to see that happen, because it's introducing some more like competition while also a brand new way of interacting with your phone. I feel like phones have really just become, you know, slabs of glass. And yeah, that's it. But for me, I feel like, you know, my phone is what I need to be reliable, and it has like most of the features that I want kind of baked into one. It's a jack of all trades, but master of none. And that's just what a phone is. It's just everything that you want on your phone and that you want to carry with you. But it's not going to be great at all of those things at once, but it can get as close as it can be. So yeah, that's the iPhone 13 Pro Max to me. It's more phone than I'll probably need for the next couple of years. And unless they release something really cool for the 16, I probably won't be upgrading. So yeah, that's the iPhone 13 Pro Max in 2024. If you do use an iPhone 13 Pro Max today, I do want to know in the comments down below, how has your experience been with using the iPhone 13 Pro Max? And if you're looking at getting one, do ask me any questions that you might have about it, and I'll try to answer them all down below in the comments. And yeah, that's it. If you liked what you saw, consider leaving a like down below and subscribing to see more content just like this. I'll see you guys in the next video, and thanks for watching.